Okay, so we're going to start off the reproductive system with kind of an overview of what the reproductive system entails, and then we're going to go into the first part of it, which is the male reproductive system, and then we'll get into the female reproductive system, like I said, likely tomorrow. So let's talk about the overview of the reproductive physiology. What is the reproductive system all about? So we're going to talk about gametes. Gametes are the sex cells. They are housed in the gonads. The gonads are the organs, the reproductive organs, male and female, they're going to be different, that house these sex cells. We're going to talk about gene sorting a little bit, meiosis, and how it differs from mitosis. This should be a review for you. We're going to talk about the structures involved, the components involved in the reproductive system, the hormones involved, cells, and so on. And then we're going to speak about fertilization and then patterns of reproductive activity, such as puberty and sexual maturation. So we're going to get into talking about how reproduction occurs and how that is useful in the human lifespan. Okay, so we are going to talk about some sensitive topics. We're going to talk about sex. We're going to talk about the sex hormones and the sex structures. So just kind of bear that in mind. This may be a little bit more sensitive information for some. If anything makes you uncomfortable, please feel free to let me know, and we can have a conversation around that. Okay, so our first objective is to describe the role of sex chromosomes and sex hormones in the development of sexual characteristics. So let's talk about the structures of the reproductive system first. So these are all the organs that are involved in mating, gametogenesis, or anything that has to do with the production of offspring. Okay, so that is kind of the end goal of all of the reproductive system, the production of offspring, the carrying on of the human life form, right? So we've got the gonads, which include the testes for males, the ovaries for females, and remember there are two gonads. The main function of the gonads is to produce the sex cells or the gametes. Males are going to produce sperm, females are going to produce eggs. So those are the gametes or the sex cells that each sex produces. The second role of the gonads is for the secretion of hormones that are required to regulate the reproductive cycle as well as to mature the sex cells, okay? So the secretion of hormones, which are going to be different for males and females. We've got testosterone and other androgens in males. We've got estrogen and progesterone in females, but the role of those hormones is to regulate the cycles as well as to develop the sex cells or the gametes. And then we also have accessory reproductive organs. These are going to be things like the prostate glands, the mammary glands, the bulbourethral glands, the penis, the uterus, all that. Those are accessory reproductive organs that are kind of helping the gonads to achieve their role in offspring production or reproduction. Let's speak about the hormones here. So in males, we have the testes, which produce androgens. In females, we have the ovaries producing estrogens and progesterone. Now, although these are kind of distinct for each sex, understand that both hormones are found in both sexes, okay? They're in different proportions, which bring about the male physiology and then the male physical phenotype, as well as the female physiology and the female phenotype. They differ in proportions, but understand that they're found in both sexes. So it's kind of a misnomer to think that females don't have testosterone and that males don't have estrogens, okay? The adrenal cortex also helps in the production of androgens. So we spoke about the adrenals before. There's the medulla and the cortex. We talked about some of the other hormones of the cortex, such as the aldosterone that we talked about in the renal system, but the cortex also plays a role in secreting androgens that are critical for sexual maturation and regulating the reproductive cycle as well. The accessory reproductive organs are, as I mentioned before, organs and structures that help to transport the gamete. So think about the reproductive tract. We've got the uterine tubes, we've got the uterus, we've got the vagina. All of those are just helping in the role of transporting those gametes so that reproduction can take place, or in the case of females, actually housing that offspring until the time of birth. The other glands, again, I spoke about these. We've got the prostate gland, the bulbourethral glands that are actually kind of lubricating the tract, also helping in the transport of those gametes. All right, let's speak about the act of copulation. So copulation is the actual act of mating. In layman's term, we call sex or sexual activity. This is when sperm is being deposited into the female, specifically in the vagina, and then sperm can make their way up the reproductive tract of females, and they can fertilize the ovum that is hopefully waiting in that reproductive tract. Post-fertilization, we have pregnancy or gestation. This has two different phases. The first couple of months we call the production here an embryo. And then beyond 2 to 3 months or so, we call this a fetus up to the time of birth. And then beyond birth, we obviously call it an infant until it begins to develop. And we start to call this a child, right? So we have an embryo, a fetus, and then an infant post-gestation. Now we should know, right, this is kind of common knowledge at this point, that the period of gestation is about 9 months. And if you actually count the weeks, it's closer to 10 months, but this can vary depending on different states, depending on different women, different pregnancies, but typically about 9 months until parturition, which is what we call birth. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how we develop into male versus female. So the events that kind of take place after fertilization, after that immediate meeting of the ovum and the sperm that lead up to parturition, that lead up to gestation or pregnancy. So there are chromosomes that are fused, and the chromosomes here are what determine whether this fetus will become a female and have ovaries, or whether this female will become a male and have testes. And this whole process is what we call sex determination. It happens right after fertilization, in that 2-week period immediately after fertilization. So the chromosomes that govern sex determination are found on the Y chromosome. And there's a specific gene there called the SRY gene, SRY standing for sex determining region of the Y chromosome. And these are the genes that govern the production of testes versus ovaries. So if the gene is present, meaning that if there is a Y chromosome and we have those SRY genes, then they're going to send signals to the cells of this developing fetus, or embryo at this point, to produce testes. Whereas if the SRY is not present, the kind of default option is that ovaries are going to be produced, ovaries are going to persist. So some school of thought like to think that the default sex of all human beings is female, and that has some truth to it. So if you do nothing to a fertilized embryo, if there isn't an SRY gene, it will just naturally progress along the path of producing ovaries and becoming a female, whereas it requires some type of interruption for the development of the male characteristics, testes, and so on. What the SRY gene actually codes for is a group of proteins that are called testis determining factor. And if this is present, then testes will develop, and if it's absent, then ovaries will develop. So just to kind of package that a little bit better, we have the Y chromosome. On the Y chromosome, we have genes called the SRY gene, and those SRY genes, remember genes code for proteins, those SRY genes code for the testis determining factor, and if that's present, then the cells will begin to produce testes. If it's absent, the cells will go on to produce ovaries. Okay. So essentially, sex differentiation is controlled by hormones. Again, in that first 2-week period, the embryo will begin to differentiate whether the TDF is present or whether it's absent. So if the testis determining factor is present, we start to get things like the Wolffian duct. And this is what progresses to become the male reproductive structures, the vas deferens and the prostate and so on. If the testis determining factor is not there, then the Mullerian duct is what progresses. So it's kind of one structure that can differentiate depending on the influence of those hormones, the influence of that testis determining factor. And the Mullerian duct is what is the precursor to the female structures. So the uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina, etc. Now, if the testes are present, so thinking about the path of going down the male reproductive structures, if testes start to develop, then the testis will secrete testosterone. And the testosterone is what will stimulate the development of the Wolffian duct. And so if we don't have testosterone, then Mullerian inhibiting hormone, if we don't have testosterone, then the Wolffian duct regresses and the Mullerian duct develops instead. So the testes that begin to develop are going to secrete testosterone along with Mullerian inhibiting hormone, or MIH, and those two hormones together will facilitate the development of the Wolffian duct as well as the degeneration of the Mullerian duct. But if there isn't any testosterone, because there isn't any testes, or there aren't any testes, then the Mullerian duct will persist because we don't have that Mullerian inhibiting hormone and we don't have testosterone. Okay, the Wolffian duct will naturally regress. All right, so this schematic kind of shows what's happening here. So in the beginning, this is a sexually undifferentiated embryo here, and we can see that both sets of structures are present, the Wolffian duct and the Mullerian duct, as well as the primitive gonad. So these are going to become either testes or ovaries, depending on, again, that Y chromosome coding for that SOY and that testis determining factor. When we begin to see differentiation, we see testes if we have the TDF, or ovaries if we don't. And so if you think about the development here, the testes and ovaries kind of develop in the same place. Although the testes in males eventually descend down into the scrotal sac, which is outside of the body cavity, they begin their development in the exact same place, which is in the pelvic cavity, or in the kind of the posterior abdominal area. All right, so the female development is going to give us ovaries. The Mullerian duct is going to progress to give us the uterine tubes, the uterus itself, and the vagina, whereas the Wolffian duct, along with the production of testosterone and Mullerian inhibiting factor, are going to give us the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, which produce lubricating fluid for the sperm, the vas deferens, which are the tract that lead to the penis itself, and the urethra. Okay. So here we'll speak about the patterns of reproductive activity over the course of the human lifespan. So they're kind of different phases of reproduction, right? Fetuses are not born with the immediate ability to reproduce, but they begin to develop this ability at around puberty. So at around 10 to 14 years of age, we begin to see sexual maturation. We begin to see development of the reproductive organs, the penis, the breast in females, the vagina, etc. And females can begin to ovulate their ova in hopes of getting that ova fertilized, and begin to develop their gametes respectively. We also see the secondary sexual characteristics develop. For males, it's the deepening of the voice, it's the muscle mass, the redistribution of fat, bone mass, bone density. We see those long bones start to grow. We also see the production of hair growing in the pubic region for both males and females, and other types of sexual characteristics. This starts to happen at around 10 to 14 years. Now there's this disorder that's called precocious puberty. And precocious puberty is when puberty begins before the age of 10, so sometimes 8, sometimes 9 years old, we begin to see puberty. And that is more of a recent phenomenon. We're starting to see that more and more. And there's a lot of theories behind why that may be so. There's the theory of estrogens in the food that we're eating? Are there estrogen-like molecules in things like the plastic that we're consuming food out of? And those are some of the theories that are thought to explain why we're seeing more precocious puberty. But typically, puberty should be within 10 to 14 years of age. We even see puberty that happens later than 14 years of age, and that is usually in males. We usually see males have a later puberty than females. The other part of the reproductive activity is sexual maturation. So sexual maturation is when a male or female gets to that fully matured reproductive stage. This is where females begin to see system cycles. So we start to see the uterine cycle happening here, the ovarian cycle happening here. And then this kind of leads up to menopause for females. So full sexual maturation is, usually through the course of the female's adult life, 20s, 30s, 40s, and then usually around 40s and beyond, we begin to see menopause, which is where females lose that reproductive capacity. Now, again, to give you some kind of updated literature here, there's a lot of questioning of this idea happening. There's a lot of new literature that's emerging, especially in the field of biogerontology and aging, that is kind of suggesting that females don't actually lose their reproductive capacity, that females may, if needed, have stem cells that could continue reproduction a little bit beyond 40, beyond 50, which is what we kind of think now. So when you guys get to, studying this, probably if you end up going to grad school, if you get more involved in this type of science, you may see new data emerging in terms of menopause and in terms of females losing their reproductive capacity at around 40. In terms of males are thought to retain their full reproductive capacity throughout their life. So up to 70 and beyond, males can produce sperm, although the quality of that sperm kind of diminishes with age. As a part of, wear and tear of the body, wear and tear of the body the structures, males can, in fact, reproduce beyond that age of sexual maturation well into their elderly ages.